Hey there, and welcome to Marvel Snap Zone's weekly tier list of up-to-date decks for you to play in hit card battler Marvel Snap. We understand here at Marvel Snap Zone the metagame of a game like this is constantly evolving, so we're going to try and bring you a tier list like this every single week with highlights on the kind of best performing decks out there from community tournaments and just general ladder play, and decks that we think are kind of on the brink to push their way in, and hopefully that's something you enjoy. So first of all, let's take a look at our published tier list for this week. If you're interested in just that information, you want to know where we've put stuff and how we rank it, it'll be on screen for you in a nice little tier list in a second. You can just grab that screenshot and be on your way. Alternatively, it's also available in our freshly published article over at Marvel Snap Zone. If you're more interested in the decks themselves, the cards they play, and kind of how they play out, I'm going to take some time to break those down for you after this, segment them with some bookmarks on YouTube so you can come and find your favorite deck and get an idea about it as often as you'd like. So without further ado, let's take a cheeky peek at this week's complete tier list, shall we? So there you go. If all you're after is the information, it's on the screen for you now. Our tier 1 this week, looking at Deathwave, Sarah Magic, and the Mr. Negative deck. Deathwave been a staple of the format for a very long time, but Mr. Negative and Sarah Magic making their way up to tier 1 this week. Tier number 2, we've got Sarah Miracle making its way up just a little bit. The Sandwave Lockdown deck keeping its position. The Hella Discard deck making its way into tier number 2. And the Discard Combo deck unfortunately making its way down into tier 2 this week. Tier 3, the Destroyer Combo deck making its way back up from tier 4 last week. And the Bounce deck staying where it was in the previous week as a tier 3 option for you. And tier number 4, we've got the Movement deck and the Patriot deck staying where they were. The Discard Swarm deck making its way down into tier 4 this week, and a brand new addition in the Cerebro 6 deck making an appearance in tier number 4 as well. That's what we think mostly for the tier list for this week, so let's take a look at some of these deck lists and walk you through what they are all about. Okay, so we're going to start at the very top with the big cheese of the format. Here is Deathwave. If you're not familiar with Deathwave, it's very much based around the card you see in the bottom right-hand corner here, Death. Death is a really big, powerful payoff for an archetype like this. 9 cost unit, 12 attack, but gets 1 cheaper for every single card you destroy. Now, the key synergy here is with Wave. Wave being the 3 cost, 3 power unit. It's going to find itself making, next turn, cards in both players' hands costing 4. What a lot of people don't realize straight away is the cost reduction of Death is applied on top of Wave's reduction, which means sometimes you can just end up with a 0 cost Death on turn 4, which is a really, really powerful synergy and lets you kind of have these ridiculous end games that no one else can really keep up with. Even without Wave, you can find yourself often costing Death for 5 or 6 in this deck quite easily, based on all these early destruction effects such as Yondu, Carnage, and Deathlock with things like Bucky Barnes, and most of all, Killmonger, really, really strong in this strategy, plays very well with killing off your own Yondu, Hood, Angels, if need be, but also all of your opponent's squirrels and random 1-drops in their 1-drop central decks all count towards reducing Death. We've got the most powerful endgame possible here, really good bridge card in Rescue on turn 4, most stats you can have on a 4-drop, and then all these huge 6s on the end. Chavez, guaranteed to draw, plays very well alongside Wave to put 21 powers worth of stats into play on turn 6, or we also have Leader available to us in this deck as well, who's going to be really, really good to kind of just mirror our opponent's last turn and make sure that our turn is bigger than theirs, whether they like it or not. Mainstay of the game at this point, definitely a deck you want to have on your radar. Also in tier 1 this week, the Sarah Magic deck. This one a little more complicated, kind of hard to explain if you're not fundamentally used to what it's doing, but it's based around the big cheese once again in the bottom corner here. The Sarah. Sarah is an ongoing effect, 5 cost, 5 attack unit. The cards in your hand will cost 1 less if you're playing Sarah this time around, with a minimum of 1. So as you can imagine, this ends up letting you have some really big endgame turns as well. The real big power payoff here is combining Magic and Mystique on turn 6. Sarah's going to reduce Magic to being 4 cost, Mystique down to being 2 cost, which means you can create a second Sarah with Mystique and have Magic grant you a turn 7 with a deck like this. And obviously your opponent not knowing turn 7 is coming, they might overextend into certain locations. It's going to give you plenty of advantage with you having that information and not knowing it. It's what makes Magic such a good card. But this deck really, really thrives off the fact that it can basically play its whole hand after this, because you have 2 Ceras in play that make everything cost 2 less, which plays very, very well with Bishop. You're going to fill your locations with Mojo. You're going to have all the units you could possibly want to play with Angela. Cheap 3-cost Iron Man. The end game potential in this deck just super unrivaled. You get that surprise factor of a 7th turn and just able to hold all your information until the very end of the game, letting you snap early to earn extra cubes. So really sweet deck, very powerful, utilizing that synergy between Magic, Mystique, and Serra. Lastly, our last tier 1 deck of the week, Mr. Negative. This deck is one of the coolest ways, I think, to play Marble Snap, and it's definitely one of my favorite decks you can play. The namesake card this time, a little cheaper, Mr. Negative here, on 4. On reveal, swaps the power and cost of every single card that's left in your deck. So for the most part, you're going to be able to balance this by only drawing 2 cards. This deck is looking to circumvent that and get a little cheaty on the matter. We play a lot of cards that you can see here that are really big mainstays of the game that have low attack but high cost. Things like Jubilee, Iron Man, even White Tiger. These are, Devil Dinosaur. These are effects that are just fundamentally incredible and arguably quite broken when they have their stats flipped with Mr. Negative. But we're looking to dip into our deck a little more, courtesy of effects like Lockjaw. Lockjaw really good at letting you play out these units to recycle themselves back into the deck, pull something out that you've already negatived, which is really, really powerful. We're also utilizing other packages in this deck that play very, very well together. Wong, obviously fantastic with these Iron Hearts, these Wolfbanes, these White Tigers, but also lets you do some really cool stuff with Gambit. This deck also just guilty of playing Magic. It wants to draw an extra card that it's already negatived and turned into a more powerful card, and granting yourself a turn 7 with that surprise factor, once again, just super powerful. So Magic included in this deck list as well. Really fun to play. A lot of pull 3 cards in this one, unfortunately, but Mr. Negative is kind of a very unique spin on Marble Snap and lets you do all kinds of powerful synergies that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So very, very cool deck. We'll move on to tier number 2 here. We have the Miracle version of Serra. This is less kind of what you saw in tier 1. It's some very similar cards, but slightly different endgame game plan here. Not looking to duplicate Serra, just looking to have this most powerful turn 6 possible, as opposed to that whole turn 7 super turbo boost. So a little more mid-range, a little bit further down. Some really powerful 1-2 punches in this deck still, though. You still have access to the whole Ghost Rider Lady Sif combination plan to Ghost Rider a big unit back into play. You can even do that with Swordmaster on turn 6, courtesy of Serra as well, which is very cool. But this deck looking to kind of just dump its hand on the last turn of the game as best it can to utilize things like Ant-Man, Angela, Bishop, Mojo, these really big payoff effects for having full boards and playing lots and lots of cards. A synergy in this deck that a lot of people don't necessarily realize. Mysterio has to be counted as playing 3 separate cards in a deck like this, because you don't want your opponent to know where the real one is, of course, which plays really, really well with Bishop. Bishop triggers 3 times off Mysterio. It's a synergy I'm a really big fan of, and your illusions will also trigger your Angelas and stuff like that. Maximus, a really sweet card in this deck, another fantastic card on the last turn of the game to kind of make your opponent not be able to use those bonus cards, kind of get that extra little bit of juice, and 7 attack for the trouble with no real downside. This deck plays great, again, super big endgame turns, or you can just use Serra to kind of play out like 6 to 7 cards sometimes on the last turn of the game, which is super, super impressive. So really cool deck. Highly recommend the Serra Miracle deck. A slightly more off-curve choice here in Tier 2 this week. It's a deck I'm a really big fan of as well. Kind of utilizes Pool 2 cards really well now that Sandman has been brought into Pool 2. We also Sandman Lockdown. Now, if you're a fan of other card games, you might see this as kind of like the anti-meta choice, the death and taxes of the game at the moment, if you like. We're going to be trying to play cards that are very aggressively costed on rate, and limit what our opponent is able to do each turn to utilize being so top-heavy. We get to play things like Ebony Maw, because we're not making early plays, and we're not going to be trying to fill every location. And we get to kind of utilize cards like Mr. Fantastic and Claw, because again, our locations are going to be fairly empty, and we are only playing 1 card a turn. Now, why is that? That's because of the powerhouse of Wave and Sandman. Wave, once again, kind of this instrumental card in locking your opponent into only being able to play one card for 4 important parts where you want to shut down go wide turns. Really good against those Sarah strategies we were just talking about. But it plays really well with Odin as well, because Odin's going to let you re-trigger that wave, so you can find yourself often locking your opponent to only being able to play one card a turn via Wave and Odin. Alternatively, you can force the issue with Sandman, a card that only lets people play one card per turn, and when you're built to abuse that, you're going to be the one kind of succeeding in that environment. Cards like Jubilee, putting extra power into play, again, Mr. Fantastic and Claw, bumping multiple locations, White Tiger, Doctor Doom, Leader, this big endgame package, all about multiple bodies across multiple locations to abuse the fact that both players are only playing one card a turn. You kind of get that little twist on the end as well with Captain Marvel being able to move itself from location to location to kind of secure you a win depending on where you need it to go. Really, really sweet deck here as well. Just underneath we have the Hela discard deck. Hella fun if you ask me, but definitely the most high-rolly, sometimes luck-orientated deck in the format, in the game, but it's a blast to play. So Hela is definitely the payoff here. You can see her on the end here. Unfortunately, a little cut off by the crop this week. But she's an effect that when you play her, she'll bring back every single card you've discarded this game to random locations, which is a super powerful effect, but definitely super random in its variance. So we have a lot of the big discarders in this deck, things like Blade, Lady Sif, Black Cat discarding itself, Moon Knight, Swordmaster, even Hellcow. These are all ways to just kind of chunk these fatties that you see in your deck away, so you can revive them all with Hela in the late game. The risk of this, of course, is discarding your Ghost Riders and your Hellas, which if you do will kind of lead you to being a bit of a subpar ramp deck over the course of the game and having to play out some of your 6-drops naturally on the last turns of the game. There is a way for you to get around this though, via the powerful Invisible Woman in Pool 3. She stops cards being revealed until the very final turn of the game, so it's quite easy for you to hide some discard effects next to Invisible Woman on the location you put her on, and then hide Hela on that location as well. So the last turn of the game will involve flipping 2 discard effects and then having Hela flip up and revive the things you discarded, which is super powerful. Alternatively, just don't draw Hela till turn 6, and I'm sure you'll find this deck to be just fine. So really solid choice here, once again, in Tier 2. A little further down, we have the discard combo deck. Now, this is definitely going to be utilizing a lot of the same tricks as the Sarah deck we talked about earlier on, just trying to abuse some slightly different payoffs this time around. You can do some very disgusting things with a deck like this, combining Wong with Mystique and Gambit. Lets you discard a whole array of cards from your hand to just blow up tons of your opponent's units. But on top of that, Wong obviously working very well here with all the discard effects. It's going to let you discard multiple times. When you're playing cards like Swarm and Apocalypse, that's really good news. Swarm's going to make more and more copies of itself for you to play out on that last turn of the game, go super wide, and Apocalypse is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually you're going to want to discard that to your Dracula on the last turn of the game to get a surprise power boost, or you're going to want to play out that Apocalypse itself as a big, like 20 power endgame unit. We tie this together with some other cards that care about you discarding, things like Morbius and the Collector. Collector looking a little weird here maybe, but it plays really well with Apocalypse and Swarm, as both of those cards return to your hand when they've been discarded in some capacity. Colleen Wing buff, kind of increasing this deck's power potential on the bottom. No more Blades, so you're never having to risk discarding things that are cheaper than Swarm. Yeah, a lot of powerful things this deck can do. Once again, utilizing magic to get that extra turn of the game and go a little bit bigger as well. That card kind of just shining all over the place. So really sweet list here in discard combo. We'll take a look at Tier 3. We go on to one of the more memey decks, I think, of the game personally, but definitely powerful enough to win some games. We have Destroyer. This deck kind of got a bump this week, courtesy of the release of Daredevil in the new Seasons Pass. Daredevil, of course, letting you see your opponent's plays on turn 5, kind of lets you manage locations better with a deck like Destroyer. If you're not familiar with Destroyer, it's this big 6-cost, 16 power unit you see in the bottom right that destroys everything else when it comes into play on your side of the locations. That's normally obviously a pretty big downside, but you can bend the game to allow you to protect some cards and keep 2 locations alive via cards like Armor, which is going to stop things from being destroyed, or Cosmo, that's going to stop your next on-reveal effect, or things like Professor X, which are going to keep a location locked down so that nothing can be added, removed, or destroyed. The synergy between Daredevil and Professor X, a super powerful upgrade for this deck, because you get to see where your opponent's going to play things on turn 5, and then you can guarantee yourself a location they are not playing to with Professor X's powerful ongoing ability. So other really powerful choices in a deck like this, you get to play Green Goblin and Hobgoblin because you're looking to keep the side of your board clear and win locations by giving your opponent negative power. You get to play some of the other destruction synergies, so you can play things like Bucky Barnes and Nova because you're happy to blow them up with either Carnage or Deathlock or the Destroyer when it comes to your big endgame turns. And then one really, really sweet card in this deck is Warpath. Warpath going to get a bonus if you have 1 empty location to make it into a really big unit. And this deck's really good at having 1 empty location after the Destroyer is done, sweeping everything up. So super powerful 4-cost unit, kind of playing that rescue role and giving you more stats for the cost than you would think, which makes this deck super sweet. And I highly recommend checking out the Destroyer if you've got the cards. Bounce. This is my favourite archetype in the game, and a deck I am notorious for playing far too much of. It's got so many cool moving pieces and does so many unique things. This deck is based on Beast and Falcon. They're 2/2-drop units that are going to return chunks of units back to your own hand, which doesn't seem particularly great on face value. Falcon's going to pick up all your 1-drops. Beast will pick up everything at the location you play it in, but it will make those cards cost 1 less in the future. Now, why do we want to replay all of our cards over and over again? Well, once again, it's that powerful 1-2 duo of Angela Bishop that are really, really good at kind of rotating through cards to increase their power every single time you play something. But we're also playing powerful on-reveal effects that we want to utilize multiple times. Things like Iceman, Korg, the Hood, Black Widow. These are really powerful effects that you can pick up and play again to continue to disrupt your opponent's ability to play the game while growing your Angelas and your Bishops. This deck's even got a really spicy little package inside to abuse Human Torch. Human Torch, a really big payoff in the pool 3, unfortunately. But it's going to double its power every time it moves. Now, we can play Iron Fist and Cloak alongside this to really kind of bolster its attack as it moves around the board, and then we can rebuy Iron Fist and rebuy Cloak to move it around even more over the course of the game, so you can sometimes end up with like a 16 or even 32 power Human Torch at the end of the game by shuffling it around the board and rebuying Iron Fist and Cloak to keep shuffling it around the board. You can also, of course, pick it up with Falcon or Beast and move it to another location that way. That doesn't increase its attack, but it will let you kind of secretly move 16 power to a location where your opponent didn't expect it to be. And that's a really, really strong effect as well. So highly recommend trying out Bounce. It's definitely my favourite way to play. Last but not least, this week's Tier 4 movement, unfortunately finding itself a little bit further down the pecking order. This deck very much taking what we were just saying about the Human Torch and amplifying that up to 11. You are looking to move as many things as you can across the board as often as you can to kind of generate extra bonuses, extra power, and in some cases, extra units. You have Human Torch, Iron Fist, Cloak, cards we all just talked about. But the payoffs in this deck that you don't have otherwise, Dagger gets bigger every time you move it based on how many things are at the location you move it to. Craven gets bigger every time you move something to its location. Multiple Man, leaving a copy of itself behind at the previous location when you move it over. And Vulture getting +5 every single time you move it to another location. So we're looking to kind of abuse this alongside things like Hulkbuster and Forge to pump those units, give Multiple Man some extra stats before we start doubling it. America Chavez gives us the consistency we need to draw our cards and our game plan early on while giving us a backup plan on turn 6. And then the kind of like big final payoffs to move cards around here. Doctor Strange going to help move your highest statted unit around. Plays very well with Dagger, Forge, and buffed up Multiple Men. And then of course Heimdall on the end, the big electric slide, if you will, to move everything to the left by one location. Trigger all those movement effects one final time on the final turn of the game. The deck's really fun to play and can be quite hard to play around sometimes when you're not used to how your opponent can move things from location to location, gain all these extra bonus stats stats you weren't expecting. So it's really good for kind of farming cubes against some players. But all in all, unfortunately, just a little bit too weak to be breaking into the top 3 tiers this week. Still a really cool deck we definitely want to highlight. Discard Swarm finding itself down in tier 4 this week as well. Very similar to the Discard combo deck we talked about earlier, but this more all-in on Swarm and trying to generate as many copies as it can, as big as it can. So we're actually utilizing things like Beast this time to pick up our discard effects and try and re-discard Swarm via Colleen Wing, Blade, Swordmaster, these kind of effects to kind of really juice those swarms to the max. We have a Koye in this deck to hopefully give our cards bonuses in our deck before we start doing the thing. And then once again, Angela, Bishop, these super powerful effects that reward us for playing multiple cards in the same turn, or just as many cards as we possibly can. Endgame here, very similar to the other discard decks. America Chavez, Apocalypse, once again, best ways to abuse discarding many cards. This one, really solid choice to play early, only 2 pull 3 cards in this deck, and also only 2 pull 2 cards, so you can play shells very similar to this. Very early on in your Marvel Snap adventure, which is kind of great. The same can't be said for the next deck. We go to Patriot. Patriot, one of the more unique decks in the format, but definitely heavy on pull 3 cards, not something you get to access until later on. This is kind of like a vanilla beatdown deck in a way. Patriot, a card designed to abuse the fact that you can play cards that have no abilities, and if you do, they all get +2 attack. So this is going to try and utilize as many of the cards in the game as possible with no abilities, and things that generate cards with no abilities, and then pump them all with Patriot and possibly a copy of Patriot thanks to Mystique. The big main deck copies of cards here that don't have abilities: Misty Knight, Mysterio's Illusions, Squirrel Girl, Squirrel, Shocker, Cyclops, Rocks from Debris, The Thing, Doombots from Doctor Doom. These are all abilities that aren't there. Basically, they are creating units that have vanilla text or flavor text on them that all get pumped by Patriot. It's a really good aggro go wide deck here. Very unique. Onslaught at the top end here, also going to double up Patriot and Mystique to give you even more ridiculous bonuses to have stupidly large statted minions. The deck's very powerful, but definitely kind of linear, and kind of relies on finding Patriot and Mystique on curve. Otherwise, you're kind of just playing slightly above statted minions, which doesn't tend to be enough in this game currently. So really sweet. Highly recommend trying it out if you crack Patriot. Definitely a deck worth playing to have some fun. And last but not least, our new entry this week. This one's really cool, and I look forward to trying it out myself at some point in the future. Cerebro, a really sweet build-around card that's offered to you in Pool 3. All cards of the highest power you control will get an extra +2 attack. So you can build Cerebro to kind of play around a certain stat line. You want to pick a number and build your deck to have as many cards as possible with that amount of attack to bump them all up as much as you possibly can. This one, picking 6, is a really big number, and it's a large stat line. Obviously going to be very good to have 8 or 10 power on every single thing you have in play. And it's a bit clunky as a result, but it's playing some really interesting cards to kind of fill the gaps in. Hood, really good destruction fodder alongside Bucky Barnes for a card like Carnage. If Carnage kills enough cards, 2 cards only I believe, it's 6 stats, which is fantastic. The Winter Soldier that comes out of Bucky Barnes, it's a 6. The Demon made by the Hood, also a 6. The recent quote-unquote nerf to Swordmaster makes it a 6. The nerf to Hellcow makes it a 6. All these powerful cards that I've seen play for a very long time now, having that 6 power stat line, and this kind of gets a really sweet little payoff at the end with cards like Hela and Onslaught to kind of benefit from Swordmaster and Hellcow discarding cards, and Onslaught just doubling up Cerebro much like Mystique, which is really sweet. So lots of secret power here, kind of utilizing cards that are good in a lot of different decks, and throwing them all together to create this very unique mid-range package trying to abuse Cerebro, which is something that I think is a really cool design and can't wait to try out when I have access to the cards to play this one myself. So yeah, that's been our tier list for Marvel Snap this week over at Marvel Snap Zone. If you want to try out any of these decks for yourself, you can grab the deck lists over at www.marvelsnapzone.com. Come and check it out. We've got all kinds of guides, content, and podcasts to improve and enjoy your gameplay experience when you're playing Marvel Snap. If you need anything else from us or anyone else at the .gg network, we look forward to hearing about it in the comments section or in the replies. I've been HowlingMines. This has been Marvel Snap Zone. Take care, and I'll see you next week. Have a good one.